Hello, it's just David here with my weekly message. In 10 questions this week, we're going to be talking about ethics and values. Why should I be good? And I divided that into two sections. So I've put the be good in brackets because I think, first of all, why should I is the question that well, generally children, but sometimes adults ask, why should I? Why should I do what you say, what society says, what the Bible says, etc., etc.? And then why should I, in particular, be good? What is goodness? And who decides what goodness is? And so there's two, you know, separate questions there, really. Um, do you? I mean, I have this thing of sort of often reading about people who I kind of quite enjoy their lives, but I don't really admire them in the end or their thoughts. I just find them interesting, and I suppose a couple that I sort of find interesting in that way because their world is so different to me is um, Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. So, for those of you who haven't heard of them, very briefly, they were sort of left wing and indeed left bank philosophers in Paris for a very long time. I can't quite remember, but I mean, from before the Second World War, well up to sort of 70s, I think even 80s. Not quite sure when they died. Um, they were typical sort of left bank Parisians, and I say sort of left wing um, leaning, and they lived that sort of well, life that perhaps all of us secretly want to lead, but actually never quite dare. So, important thing of Sartre, despite being sort of a great sort of known to be sort of the best thinker of his generation in France. I can't remember which, but failed one of his exams. Basically, he never secured an academic post. He became a writer, but basically, rather than doing it kind of through the universities, he became a sort of thinker and writer just by sitting in um, Paris cafes, Le Domago, I think it is, where he would sit with Beauvoir, and he'd just spend his whole day there in that sort of cafe society that I have in Paris. So that's probably what's so appealing. And his thing was, people would just come and have coffee, and he would write and say Simone Beauvoir, who was kind of his partner in this kind of open relationship they had over many decades. And I think she was slightly more, what's the word? Conventional. And I think she did have some teaching posts, but actually her great love and the way she wanted to live her life was to be with Sartre and just to write. Um, and that's what they did. I mean, yeah, they just spent most of their time doing that archetypical thing we imagine from sort of French society, sitting in a say left bank Parisian cafe, drinking cafe, having sort of quite a lot of alcohol in the evening, smoking gouloir, writing stuff, and getting sort of full of angst and stuff. They were the fathers of sort of well, it was a father, obviously, father and mother. Well, one of the great things about what's called existentialism, which is a world that frightens everybody, but yeah, it's not actually that hard. I think about existentialism is like a lot of these things. People get frightened by these words, and actually, but then every day they act like existentialists, just don't know it. Um, because really, what they thought, even though actually the sort of their political views have gone out of fashion, um, what they thought and the way they talked and the way they popularized ideas. Every time you turn on a TV advert, or every time you watch a lot of um, sort of reality shows, you will hear sort of Sartre repeated to you 1,000 times. You just don't realize it. Um, and that's because existentialism says, really the most important thing in life is not to conform to a kind of set pattern what a human being ought to be or a human being ought to act. Rather, you in the end kind of create your own values and set your own goals, and the important thing is to be authentic and stick to them. Um, and that's and for Sartre and Beauvoir, that's the kind of way of life that they tried to embrace. Now, having read a bit about them, one of the reasons I don't want to be them is actually um, they were generally seem to be sort of very unhappy. Their life does always seem to be sort of full of angst and breakdowns and scenes and all the rest of it. Um, so I'm not sure. It appears quite glamorous, this sort of Parisian cafe life, but I think perhaps suburban English life has, in the end, has a lot to kind of commend it. But the reason I want to talk about this is as I say, this existentialist idea, which is sort of, yeah, you hear it. How many times do you hear people say, "Well, I've got my values. I want to live according to, and I think it's really, I know what my values are. I want to stick to them." And this interesting thing talking about my values, I think, because it sounds good. I've got my values. I stick to them. Sounds commendable, and in some senses it is. But I think it is quite different from the Christian view of thing and from what's gone before it. I don't think anybody would have sort of spoken in that way 150 years ago. Now, there are Christian existentialists, that's absolutely true. But I'm, yeah, not terribly convinced. I think there are sort of two problems, really, particularly in its popular form. I think, existentialism is slightly more subtle, but, there are two problems with talking about my values. I mean, the first one is very obvious: is I might have my values, but then the psychopath living next door has his values, and his value says I get a thrill by murdering people and chopping them up and dissolving their body parts in acid. Um, what if all we have is my values? How do I decide between mine and his? That may sound an extreme example, but of course, there's lots of other lesser examples, and we hear a lot of that today, don't we? This, you know, what we might say in other cultures. I mean, how much do we say, well, that's part of their culture? Well, perhaps dressing a certain way or asking, women to dress modestly or something, that might be part of a culture. But then when it comes to something like female genital mutilation or, the severest of curtailments of women's freedoms, then we say, well, actually, that's not allowed. So that's the difficulty. Where do we draw the line when we talk about values? And I think that's a kind of well-known sort of problem with this way of talking. I think the other problem with my values is, I mean, very often with my values, we're likely to rationalize, um, because there may be some things that we values that we, in a sense, find very easy to stick to. So I might say, my values is I don't carry a knife and I don't want to murder people. And I think, well, yeah, I mean, just given who I am, I'm not like I start carrying a knife and, well, yeah, I don't often want to murder people. Um, but the trouble is then the things that actually, may be my kind of blind spot, my weak spot, because I'm making up my own values. Then things that actually I am guilty of. Um, I might think, well, yeah, I'll just that value will go quite a long way down my list because actually there's a bit of me that feels a bit so bad about it. And my values, certainly the ones I talk about, are the ones that I score quite highly on. Not murdering, for instance. I mean, yeah, done pretty well with that so far in 50 something years. Of course, the alternative to that, the whole kind of my values thing, is saying there are values that come out from outside. The question is where. I mean, that's the problem, and that's really, if you take God out of the question, there's no greater, then you're in, I think, genuine trouble, because either you have my values or you have other, but well, it could be the state's value, the government's values. Well, yeah, then you're faced with the problem of sort of totalitarian regimes of fascism or communism. You say, well, actually, the values we have are those of the Third Reich or the Soviet Union, and good citizens. Those are our values. We must obey them. So that's not terribly appetizing. or can be sort of society's values more generally, in which case, we just have to do whatever you see on telly, what you hear people saying. And the trouble is, again, that can just descend into sort of chaos, really. And that's the problem, really. I think, whether you like, if you take God out of the equation, um, where are these values coming from if they're not just mine? So, I mean, boring as it may be, and I know people don't like this view, I think we have to say values come from God. Um, no, obviously, if God doesn't exist, then that in a sense is a problem, and you just have to kind of work your way through. And you can talk about sort of doing less harm, etc., and make everybody happy. It's sort of a utilitarian idea, which is probably the best you can do actually, without God. Though, yeah, that's probably what you're left with, of vaguely saying, well, I've got values that will make human beings flourish, but then of course you know, in a sense, asking what does it mean to flourish? So I think once you get rid of God, as I say, I think values become problematic. So I think in the end, I say it's in a way it's a deeply unfashionable view, but I think we have to say really our values come from God. Sometimes we find it difficult to discern them, and I think that's right. If you take, for instance, the issue of slavery and the morality of slavery, it takes us a while to kind of get there. But nonetheless, I think there are these eternal values underpinned by God, and yeah, we, by prayer and the scripture and whatever, by being a worshipping community, we find, or we discern God's values. And as I say, that's quite hard, and it's still debated today because there are some Christians and some people of other religions who have certain values which generally a lot of other people don't share. So that's again quite hard. And the danger is once you think values have kind of God's warrant, then you almost feel, well, it's right and good, I can impose these on other people. And obviously, in the world we live in, we don't want to do that, which kind of makes sense. So, as I say, that's what we're thinking about in our 10 questions, is about sort of ethics and values. But I think that's what I come back to, really, that where do our values come from? And I think the choice is my values or somewhere else. And if not God, then I wonder where those values will come from, and what's the best that we can do. And as I say, I think probably a bit like Sartre and Beauvoir, we kind of actually don't think about these things very much. We live, we'll say things because, we'll talk about my values, because we haven't really thought about it. And I just wonder whether, sometimes, we do need to think about things a bit more deeply, to kind of, work out how we're going to live as human beings with values and where those values might come from. Thank you.